Hi, I'm Tim Barton, and we're in the WallBuilders library where we have over 100,000 artifacts and documents that predate 1812. Among those, we have several hundred original sermons from very patriotic and prominent founding pastors. Among those pastors was Naphtali Daggett. Naphtali Daggett was a pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Smithtown on Long Island, New York. In 1756, he became Yale's Professor of Divinity. In 1766, he became the President Pro Tem of Yale until 1777, while continuing to teach as a Professor of Divinity and Ecclesiastical History until his death. During the Revolution, most of the universities were disrupted because of the British hostility. Americans simply didn't want to endanger their youth, so whenever the British drew close, they disbanded the school. Yale University was no exception. At that time in America, most of the college students were teenagers, as 13 and 14 was a common age for students who attended college. On the evening of July 4th, 1779, a force of 2,500 British troops approached the New Haven area, home of Yale. The university dismissed their students to return home to safety, but the next morning around 100 young men volunteered to engage the British in order to give the women and children time to escape. As the young men set up a line of defense, Reverend Daggett mounted his horse, rode past them, and took up a position in the woods outside of town. As the first British arrived, the volunteers engaged several volleys with the British, chasing the initial British soldiers out of town, only to encounter the larger force outside of town. The students then turned and fled. As the British proceeded their march into town, the Reverend Daggett now single-handedly engaged the 2,500 British. Reverend Chauncey A. Goodrich, who was a Yale student at the time, was one of the student volunteers and was present at this encounter. He wrote about what happened when the British found Reverend Daggett repeatedly firing on the British by himself in the woods. The commanding officer cried out, "What are you doing, you old fool, firing on His Majesty's troops?" "Exercising the rights of war," replied Daggett. The reply seemed to amuse the officer, who responded, "If I let you go this time, you rascal, will you ever fire again on the troops of His Majesty?" "Nothing more likely," replied Daggett. Can you imagine being outnumbered and surrounded? Daggett was given a chance to lay down his gun and surrender. But he explained to the British officer, "If you leave me alone with my musket, I will continue to fire and oppose the British." This courageous defiance from Daggett was not well received. The British arrested Reverend Daggett, and their officer commanded his troops to drive him into town. The troops forced Reverend Daggett, who was an elderly man at the time, to lead the way back to town. It was a 5-mile walk back to town, and it was reported to be the hottest day they had ever endured in that area. The soldiers kept their bayonets in Reverend Daggett's back, and every time he slowed down because of exhaustion or heat fatigue, they would drive their bayonets into his back. He received dozens of bayonet wounds because of this. The townspeople rescued him, pleading for his release, but he continued to suffer from all the wounds he had received from the bayonets. He did continue preaching at Yale University Chapel, but he died within a year of this battle, largely because of the wounds he had received. We have 2 original sermons preached by the Reverend Naphtali Daggett. But the Reverend Daggett was much more than merely a college professor or a college president or able theologian. Naphtali Daggett was a courageous patriot who sacrificed his life for the great cause of American liberty. He was one of the many members of the famous Black Robe Regiment. He was one of the many ministers who wore the black clerical robe and who boldly led the way in defending America and her rights and liberties. For more short stories and a host of other information about our founding fathers and early American patriots, please visit www.wallbuilders.com. God bless.